Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome to today's lecture on revisiting the 2000 Watt Society, innovative tool for sustainable city planning. My name is Eugene, I'm your MC for today, and welcome to this lecture. Okay. The CLC lecture is organized by the Center for Livable Cities as part of our mission to distill, create and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. Today we are delighted to have Prof. Zehnder, visiting professor and member of the Board of Trustees of NTU. He'll be presenting on the concept of the 2000 Watt Society, which is an innovative planning tool that can be used to develop energy and material efficient cities. Okay, the format for today's lecture will be two parts. One, we will start with a presentation by Prof. Zehnder, followed by a discussion between the moderator and the speaker before a Q&A session with the audience. Okay, the discussion and Q&A will be moderated by Mr. Hann, Managing Director for Miniwiz, and also Adjunct Professor at SUTD. Please kindly hold your questions to the end after the Q&A session. Okay? With this, maybe we'll invite Prof. Zehnder up on stage. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Eugene. Thank you all to be here in a week where actually you better take off a few days free after the 1st of May. So I'm really surprised to see so many faces, and thank you for coming. I would like to thank CLC also for the organizing of this talk, and actually to re-invite me after I have given a first talk about this 2000 Watt Society in 2011. So it seems that there is certain interest still there, and I'm hoping to give you a lot of news about it and to show you how it actually takes on and it becomes more and more important as a planning tool for big cities. So the idea why the 2000 Watt Society came up was that we were looking for a way how we can develop instruments for city planners which are easily understood. And I will show you then step by step what we did, but basically we wanted to have a simple thing. So it may not be 100% the best you can ever think of, but most people do actually know something about energy because you have to pay your electricity bill for kilowatt hours which you are using, so you are using watts per hour. And you have to pay for it because you have a good feeling for it. So this is basically what came out after a longer discussion to figure out how we can figure out something which is simple, a simple measure, but takes everything into account. Now, before I start, I would like to thank a few people who have actually helped me to collect or to calculate some of this data. This is Paul Chain, who is actually responsible for the construction at the NTU, and you will see a few data on NTU, so it's not something which is totally disconnected from Singapore. Then René Sick from a company, Intep, and Intep is an engineering company who is specifically looking at the energy of the buildings. Roland Stulz, who was their lead architect, and then a whole team of young people at NTU who actually started to do all the energy calculations, and I'll show you then a few data what they have figured out, but on the entire campus. So we have done quite a bit at the time for this to get a view on what actually is on the campus itself. Now, there are different efforts when you look at energy. And most countries and most organizations do actually search for the supply side. You know, how much energy can we put actually into the system? And one of the most famous one is certainly Germany's Energiewende, because they were just deciding to close down all nuclear power plants and go totally renewable without actually thinking whether they need all this energy and where they do get their energy from. So it was purely supply side. And little has been done in the last, say, 50 years on the demand side. So if you actually can reduce the demand side, you don't have to pump so much energy into the system. It only started indirectly with the CO2 discussion. So what we are looking now is to reduce the carbon dioxide release into the atmosphere, and that's at the end of the day, it's demand side, it's how much energy you are actually using. So it starts to shift in this direction. But the 2000 watt society was, before this whole discussion, already concentrated on the demand side. Now, what kind of other kind of general parameters can you use? You know, you could, as I said, CO2, but if you talk to people and say, can you reduce your lifestyle by 1 ton of CO2? People look at you and say, what do I have to do? You know, what is that? I don't even know what it is, and then secondly, what do I have to do? So it's difficult. Another thing which is very often used, specifically in the economics, is GDP, or GDP by energy. That makes sense if you calculate that per a nation, but it doesn't really make sense if you distill it down to the individual. And if you have a measure like that, it needs to be a measure which is politically implementable, but it's also understood by those who are actually touched. So it has to be very clear to all the players in the fields what that means. So at the end of the day, we came to energy, and energy is expressed in watt. And if you hear kilowatt hours, and I will tell about kilowatt hours later also, it is actually the energy you use to do a work, but basically the energy is watt. So that, with that you can cover material, you can cover work, you can cover electricity, you can cover whatever you want to. What is a good measure for all activities we do as humans? And without energy, we would have a difficult life on this earth, and life wouldn't exist, because basically at the end of the day, the sun delivers the energy, and what we are doing now is, except the nuclear power, is all we are extracting old sunlight, which was caught up in a way of fossil fuels. So that was the idea, that we have something which we can connect almost everything we do. So what does that mean? What does 2000 watt society mean? Basically, it is 1 kilowatt hour for every half hour. So as an individual, and that's per person, you are allowed to use, under the 2000 watt society, 17,500 kilowatt hours. That's quite a bit. And if you are a family of 4, you can have 4 times as much. So this is all per capita, per individual. What does that mean? If you have a big car, that means you can actually burn 1,700 liters of oil or gasoline per year. And if you have a family of 4, you can have 4 times more. So it's not basically that you have to cut everything off. It's quite a bit of energy you can use. Or you can lit 112 watt bulbs continuously during your life, but I don't think that's basically your goal you want to do. So, but that gives you a feeling that actually 2000 watt is not going back to the trees or cutting off of all the things we have been doing up to now. No, basically it is allowing us our life to live in a way which is similar or even better than it is now, by using less resources and energy. And this is all what we want to do. Now, in the last few months, specifically with the youth in the streets in Europe about the CO2 and the climate change, CO2 comes much more in the focus, and with the Paris Agreement as well. It is basically to produce 500 watts exclusively from oil corresponds about to 1 ton of CO2. That means that you basically, with a 2000 watt society, you're still allowed to produce 4 tons of CO2 if you use all your energy from fossil fuels. If you use solar, you use much less. Now, what does that mean? How much watts do we actually use? Here is a graphic of, with a few countries You see the red line there indicating the 2000 watt society. India is far below, Bangladesh is far below, the world is slightly above, China is slightly above, Germany is kind of like the rest of Europe, and then you have the US, which is much more up there. And already by looking at that graphic, you would say, hey, this would be actually an easy way. You let the big ones to cut their energy use, and you add it to the other ones, so they have actually still a growth potential. Because at the moment the discussion is everybody cuts, and then India says, hey guys, you know, you had 100 years or 200 years for development, and nobody was cutting you, and we cannot even develop ourselves, so that's unfair. So for the fairness, you can actually show that by cutting the big ones who are actually overusing the energy, you can actually add to the other ones to actually equilibrate. Where is Singapore? Singapore is about in the order of magnitude of where Germany is. It's about the same. Slightly is a little bit higher. But what does that mean? Basically, if you break all your activities down into watts. And here what I have done is actually put together how much energy you would use for public transport, air travel, for the car, for the electricity you use at home, for whatever you want to use the electricity, but also you have to include the public infrastructure. You need to include the food and consumer items because they have to be produced or transported, and then you have to work somewhere and living somewhere, so the office space and the living space is counting too. And so what you have here is the distribution, how it is at the moment, approximately throughout the US, which comes out to about 9,500 watt per capita, and the EU or Singapore is about in this area, and that may slightly differ a little bit, but not much, because say in the EU you have to heat and here you have to cool, but that kind of evens out. But you see still the public transport is a small part of the energy we are using. The air travel, which is actually now kind of devilized, if you want to, in this movement by the youth in Europe, is actually a small part. It's because they are not flying around so much. That's why they say these old guys like me flying around, you know, you have to cut down. Sure, I agree. But the thing is, there are other things which are bigger actually, which would actually bring more than only the flying. But it's good to discuss it. Automobile, you see, it's quite a bit. Electricity, which you use here specifically also for the cooling. Public infrastructure, you have to build roads, you have to entertain them, you have tunnels, you have to cool them down, you have to produce all the concrete, the glass, the steel, that all costs energy, so that's embedded energy, which is about so much. Food still needs a lot of and consumer items, maybe food a little bit less than the consumer items, but in the food sector, basically, the most energy is used when you drive with your car to the big shopping malls. That is overall seen much more because it comes in bulks, in big bulks, but you take a little bit with you and then you calculate the energy you use for the food distribution. If you get it there and bring it home, that's actually a large part of this this part here. And then the living office and the living quarter and this, where you work, it has to be cooled down, but it has to be built. The concrete, the iron, the steel, sorry, the glass, everything needs energy to be produced, and that's part of it. So we come back to that later, how much it actually is. But just to give you a feeling here, if you go to 3,000 watt, we cut a little bit on the air travel, but we can become much more efficient in this sector here. And if you go to the 2,000 watt, it actually helps when the public transport becomes bigger, because the public transport at the end of the day is an energy saver, uses less of less of energy and material. And so if we can actually increase that, cut something on the air travel, but specifically also cutting on the automobile would make a huge difference. Now the question is, do you have to go less far with the car, or do you have to have another car which is actually more energy efficient? And so whatever you do, it doesn't matter as long as you cut down on material and energy. But this gives you a kind of a feeling for what we are using, all kinds of energies. Just to give you a feeling for what the 2000 watt society idea was, is that actually we have a certain amount of energy which is non-fossil, which will grow and will stay high, say after about 2010 and so. Fossil fuels should actually decrease because that will be cutting us on the CO2 emission. And then you have embedded energy, so we become also more efficient in constructing our construction with less material or recycled material, but at the end of the day, we use less energy. And the idea was to reach somewhere about around 2050 on the fossil fuel side, about 2000 watt, and after that we should actually get to 2000 watt for the entire energy we are using. But basically this part, as long as it is renewable and it actually captures all the CO2 back which we actually released to produce it, this part here wouldn't be so bad if we are able to actually reduce this fossil fuel part to make sure that we are releasing less of climate active gases into the atmosphere. Basically, the industrialized countries were about in 1960, 2000 watt societies. So here, an idea of how you look at the building. Buildings are, first you have to construct them, and then you have to run them. And very often, if we look at the energy, we look only on the amount of energy we have to run them. And here, the group at NTU did a study and looked actually what conventional buildings in the cold climate would use. Is about 20% is embodied energy, so it's in the material. About 80% is the operational energy to run these buildings. So that all has been normalized to square meter per year. And the number here is, you have to take that with a grain of salt, because buildings differ hugely. But this is just an average number, so it comes close to what we actually do, but it's an average number, and the variance is huge. It can be 3 times as high, or it can be half of it. But this is just to give you an idea in the trend. So this absolute number here, be careful to use it. But it gives you kind of a rule of thumb. If you look to Singapore, actually, because the way in Singapore buildings are built, there is more embodied energy and less actually running in percentage. But in absolute numbers, if you look at it, it's slightly lower, and that's also very averaging from very high to very low. But basically, the more you come into warmer areas, the higher is actually the embedded energy which you have to look at. And then finally, low energy buildings are in the average about 150 kilowatt hours per square meter, but I will show you examples which are much lower, and there are this is kind of an average out of the literature. There it's almost 50-50, the energy you actually use to build these buildings and then to run these buildings. So as I said, this is all normalized per year. Now the case of NTU, so this group here of Zhang and the other collaborators, they actually looked at all the buildings on the campus. And they actually looked at how much is embedded energy and how much is actually operational. Now these are labs, and labs are always need more energy to run them. So it's not offices. Offices would not be as extreme. But there at NTU, we have 90% of the energy is actually operational. And then you have maintenance is about 2.5%. End of life, that means if you tear the buildings down, need a certain amount of energy. The material is only about 6%. The construction costs about 0.3%, transportation about 1%. So this is not for a normal living home. This is really now for a university, and all the buildings have been taken into account, the old ones and the new ones, so it's all averaging out. And you see here the number we took about 40 years lifetime of the building, because you have to see how long you run it. Then the average life cycle energy, how much it costs for a building, the operational one, and then the embodied energies, as you see, is approximately 10%. We have included material, mainly concrete, steel, glass, and the simple thing we can calculate, the whole infrastructure, like the machinery you need for science, and it has not been included there. Otherwise, this number would be slightly higher, because all these big machines need quite a bit of energy to be constructed. But this is just to show you what that means. If you talk about energy, you always have to take both sides, the operational side, that's what everybody measures, but there is also an embedded side, which is of importance as well. So when we started this whole thing, we actually asked some scientists and engineers from the industry also to come up with the idea whether this is possible, what we are talking here about, the 2000 watt society. And actually there was a big group working with industry, so the private sector was involved. They wrote this book, kind of as a white book, in 2004, and they just analyzed what the energy was in 2000. And as you look here, just the size of these arrows here, these are transformation losses in the distribution networks. These are losses from conversion to useful energy. So when you can reduce these two things, this makes a huge difference. And then this is the useful energy. And they said with the existing technology, you can actually reduce these losses to very small parts and actually have almost 2/3 of the useful energy still back. So this was the idea, to actually move from where we were in 2000 to 2050. And I will then show you where we are at this very moment. Here, just a few numbers that you get the feeling of what the reduction potential is based on existing technology. We don't have to have any innovation at this very moment. This is what we have. Just use it consequently. So you can reduce light by 20% by putting LED up there. Makes a huge difference. At NTU, we changed all the lights to LED, and we cut about 5 or 6% at the moment. Motors, engines, you can actually make them, now with the knowledge we have, 25 to 30% more energy efficient. Glass bottles, airplanes, and we see all these new developments which are coming up, that the new engines are much more energy efficient. Cars, we know that. I think we have now to do the step from the cars we have now to the future cars with a hydrogen or electricity, but then the hydrogen and the electricity have to be produced in a sustainable way. That means with less carbon dioxide emissions, but they can actually still be increased quite drastically in their efficiencies. Buildings, when you heat the buildings, you can actually, the heating is relatively easy to cut down. It's easier than the cooling, but we can actually do 75%, and the buildings itself can actually be cut down by 80%. 80% is only possible if you start from scratch, from new. Refitting buildings, you may go to about 50%, and then it becomes complicated because you are in an old structure which is not built for this kind of things. But nowadays, and I will show you in cases, is actually why it is not done at this very moment. There's actually very interesting things which have more to do with sociological aspects than with technology aspect. But the technology can do it, so it's no problem. So where are the low-hanging fruits? This green means this is the amount of energy, and this is now calculated for Switzerland for a 4-person family home. So each person uses about 1,500 watts for living and working. Here we can reduce it because the buildings I showed you easily. We can bring it down to 450. It's feasible, and I show you in cases that it was. Here, consumer goods and food is still a little bit complicated. We don't really know exactly how we distribute it to the different people. If we get a more efficient distribution network, it would make sense. And the distribution network is not so much to bring the wine from South America to Singapore. It's more kind of going to the shopping mall and buying bottle and transport one bottle in the car over 25 kilometers within Singapore and staying in, and you're stuck in traffic and so this makes, this is still open for innovation. Infrastructure, we know how we can actually cut it down. Electricity consumption, yes, on the small networks, but not on the big networks. On the big networks, it's still a big challenge. Here we still need some innovations. Mobility, as I told you, is easy to come down if we just use the technology which is used. Why it is not used? It's very simple. Car companies have done the investment for this type of cars as they are now, and they want to get that money back from the investment. If they will go to the new type of cars, they have to change actually the production chain, which actually costs a lot of money and a lot of investment. So the investment cycles play a role. If it's very long, then it takes more years than when it's very short. Or then you get people like Elon Musk, who all of a sudden from zero starts to build new cars, whether they are more energy efficient or not. It doesn't matter, but just as an example, they start from scratch. They can use whatever is the latest technology and the latest insight of it. And then also aircraft can still be slightly improved. I think mobility, public mobility and transport is close to its max. We can still kind of turn a few screws, but it's not basically changing everything. What does that mean, just as a few examples of going to a society as we are now, so going from a big SMU, a smooth card, which uses a lot of gasoline or diesel to drive around, to a more modern car who actually runs on either gas, this methane, or on hydrogen, or can be electricity if you want to. And we have a few cars who are already in this range. But we have kind of a stock of the old cars, and it takes some time to change them. Buildings, we can come down from 10 liters per square meter and year if you take just oil for heating or cooling to about 3 liters. So this is already, we are a long way in this area. We are now maybe about 6 liters, and we can still go further down. But also recycling waste, reusing waste, we have to cut on waste. And I know Singapore is thinking very hard is how we can actually cut down the waste. But at the end of the day, production of waste costs a lot of money. And to bring it then to the use about on this level here, it will take some efforts. But we had just a workshop lately where we intensively have discussed the ways of cutting it down. So, why are we not already actually putting all these things into working? You know, what is the problem? So there are road obstacles and there are roadblocks which actually interfere. So whatever you do, before people change, they want to see whether it's possible. Just show me. And then when you show me and you convince me, then I'm actually going in the right direction. Then there's an aversion to change. We all know that from ourselves. We don't want to change, and certain things need to be slightly changed. Then we have an aversion against new regulation. Everybody says, oh, now the government will make new regulations and makes our life much more difficult. No, leave it where it is, and so we are not actually getting exposed to it. Indifference, do whatever you want to, but leave me alone. And then all this yes but, and then come all the arguments why it actually shouldn't work. But then it's also, you have an opposition from the industry. The fossil and the nuclear industry is not interested in to do that. So they are willing to discuss about the CO2, at least the nuclear industry, but they are not willing to discuss about the energy, because they say we are cheap, we are not really using much we are not producing a lot of CO2. So they are actually, they don't want to change because they have made the investment and they make the money now. Fear of economic regression is always there. Oh, we have to cut, and then we will, our GDP will go down, and then all these things, and everybody else will actually take over. I will show you that that's not entirely true. Then the loss and worry about freedom, political inertness. Politicians, this is kind of a long-term planning thing. They like to get actually good points. Specifically in election years, who are kind of on a short term. This is also understandable. There's nothing wrong with it. This is the nature of the system. But it is kind of this long-term planning and implementing which is difficult. And then not understanding the concept. And so this seminar should be a point to show you actually what the concept is and how we can actually introduce that. Now, just for the showcase, show me. It's important for the rest of the story. At the time, I was the director of Water Research Institute in Switzerland. And you say, what has water to do with energy? But I was also chairing a committee of the entire ETH domain with ETH Zurich and Lausanne and the Research Institute on the discussion of how we can become more sustainable. And we just had to build a new building. And so I said, let's just actually walk the talk and not just tell everybody what they should do. Let's do it ourselves. And we built this building. The Forum Kriesbach has kind of a crazy name for a non-Swiss German speaker. This is very difficult to pronounce. So this gives you just then a little bit of an idea what the average Swiss building watt per person actually is about 3,000 for the working space and so. If we use what we call the min energy, this was a new regulation which came out in the 90s, who actually cut this amount of energy by half, and this building, this Kriesbach building, is here. So it's very low. It's, if you want to, at 500 watt per person. It is at 1 ton CO2 per person for the working space is actually what you need for the 2,000 watt society. And just to show you what the problem is in a city planning is you have a legacy. You have all the buildings who have been built under other standards. And here you have the buildings in kilowatt hours per square meter and year in Switzerland until 2020, then between 2020, 45, and so it goes on. And it stayed up here about at 105 kilowatt hours per square meter and year. And then it started to reduce because new regulations came out, min energy and min energy P. And this building here is down here. Sorry. So this Kriesbach building is actually at 1.8 watt per square meters, or about 15 kilowatt hours per square meter and year. Very low. If you look back to the numbers where I showed you that actually the energy efficient buildings are about 150, this one is 10 times lower. And the thing, it was designed to actually be at 1 watt per square meter, which means about 9 kilowatt hours per square meter and year. But then kind of the fire police came and then you had to adjust the building. But the important thing in this, and there are books written over this building, specifically an interesting book by the Holcim Foundation. The important thing which was done differently here was we didn't ask an architect to design the building. We actually said to the architect that building has to fulfill a certain amount of criteria, which you as architect, and I'm not stepping on the foot here, hopefully nobody, is you need the engineers to be involved from the very first moment. The problem with most buildings are you get the architect makes a nice building and then the engineers come and retrofit it. And that's not efficient. It has to start from the very beginning. And this was one of the first time really that I know, at least in Switzerland, this was implemented from the first day on. The architect alone, so then you made a competition and they came with all their teams, big teams with all the engineers and they designed the building from the very beginning to be as low as that. And also the gray energy here is optimized, so the embedded energy, the energy you use this building. So it's what the energy people in the building area tell me, it's still the most energy efficient building of the world. It's only very closely followed by the Siemens building in Bogota, but Bogota has an easier climate than Dübendorf in Switzerland. So it is still one of the most energy efficient buildings. It's now around for over 15 years. So I'm basically proud of it, I must say. It was was the first step. And it was an important step. Why was it an important step? It was actually took over this idea of the 2000 watt society. We first thought the federal governments or the central governments have to actually implement that. It doesn't work because it's too many interests coming together here. But it was actually caught up by the cities. And Zurich was one of, first Basel and then Zurich was one of the leading cities actually to go in this direction. And it finally came to a plebiscite. So the people had to vote. In Switzerland, we vote about all these kind of things. The government does something and then the people kind of overthrow it. But in this case, the government wanted to have the 2000 watt society as a tool for the city planning in the future. And on the 30th of November 2008, actually 76% of the people voted that the concept of the 2000 watt society is a guideline for the city planning and future development. 3/4 in such an open, basic democracy, I can tell you that's a lot. And the government, so there's still people shooting against it, but this majority is it's a hard argument. You cannot overthrow it. The question is, what has been reached so far by Zurich? So basically what the people decided on is to commit to sustainable development, to reduce the energy consumption to 2000 watt per person per year, reduce the CO2 emission to 1 ton per person in 2050, promote renewable energy and energy efficiency, and not renewing investments into nuclear power plants. So that always comes as an additional to it. So what has Zurich so far achieved? I think it's impressive. Reduction of the primary energy consumption of 1,300 watts per person since 1990. Currently, the city is at 3,900 watt per person. Since 2015, you cannot choose you can choose what kind of energy you want to what kind of electricity. If you're not choosing specifically for fossil, you have automatically renewable energy in the house. So you must say, I don't want to have renewable energy. And who is doing that? It's slightly more expensive, but it doesn't really make a big difference. But people do actually take that. It's a good move. You have to say no to it and not yes to it. This makes a huge difference. So the transport sector, the energy demand decreased by 13% since 1990. The greenhouse gas emission was reduced by 1.5 ton per person also since 1990. There is also a distinct reduction in energy consumption, greenhouse gas emission in the building sector, and the share of renewable energy has been increased from 11% to 25% in 1990. I would say this is impressive, that a whole city is actually doing that based on this votation that actually the people wanted to become more sustainable. So whatever you're set by administrators, whoever, and industrialists, that actually this is not accepted by the people, I'm not so sure. If the persons can actually decide and they have the information and the things are clear to them, they will move in the right direction. So I give you a few examples, what else has been achieved. So we have the leading cities like Zurich, Basel, and Geneva. We have guidelines on national level, including building codes, very important. Actually, the building codes were the first thing changed in the 1990s when we started to discuss that. And the building codes can be actually be helping to move something or actually stopping it. So building codes have been in a visionary way changed, that they're allowed to have this new type of buildings. Internationally, so primarily in cities in Austria, France, and Germany, and I will show you then something. EU is adapting guidelines to net zero house standards, emission reduction, and mobility. That started with the 2000 watt society, but it was then superseded also by the whole discussion about the CO2 in Paris. North America had the Green Building Council, the lead, has been influenced what has been done, and the Bayer House in Minnesota, Zero Net Energy, is typically a 2000 watt society building, and actually also based on it. We have the universities with the International Sustainable Campus Network, also NUS and NTU are part of it, eco-campuses in many universities in the US and elsewhere, and we start to get a whole thing, a lot of labels. Here is kind of the Swiss label, this too. This has come out in Minnesota, no, in Chicago for a museum who actually made an exposition on it. This is the city of Zurich, and this is Minneapolis, I come to that, who has actually designed now this new logo for it. So what is basically done? Here it actually has different levels. It's not only construction. It has to be, it has to go in the lifestyle. People have to have stories to understand. We have single buildings like the AWAC building is. We have also at the ETH Zurich and ETH Lausanne, we have buildings who are in this direction. In other research institutes, then it goes now more to neighborhoods because it can be more efficient if you look at total neighborhoods. They get certificate, you get even cities, regions. So it really goes from the individual up to big regions. That whole discussion of where we go. Example here. One example very close to Zurich, it's actually between the airport and the city of Zurich, the Richti in Wallisellen. This has been designed for something close to 2,000 watts, so it's 2,800 watt. Basically, 1,200 watt for industry production and services, traffic, transport, individual mobility and living. And this thing here has not been done by the government. This is private sector. This is the important thing. You can always do something by the government and then you say you pay a little bit or you cut the taxes. But this has been realized and built and given by this Alreal group. So this was the plan in 2010. This is the realization in 2014. So you actually, there are 1,200 people living there, 3,000 working places, and 12,700 square meter of sales floor. So it's a mix of living and working. Here a few other realizations in Zurich, the Hunziker site. Also, this has specifically been planned as a place which follows the 2,000 watt society. 1,200 inhabitants, workplace for about 1,500 people. Freilager in Zurich, you see it's always in the order of magnitude of about 1,000 to 2,000 people. This is also what HDB does. It's a kind of, it's a good size where you can actually plan. And here an example out of Basel, the Erlenmatt also for 1,400 and working place. So the things are done. basically. But what is happening outside of Switzerland? So interesting. Canberra started, the capital territory of Canberra said we want to actually do something like you guys did in Switzerland with the 2,000 watt societies. They want to start with a neighborhood for more than 5,000 inhabitants plus working places. And actually they do it in a joint venture with the city of Zurich and the Swiss specialist. So even the Aussies have got it. Then the city of Vancouver started first with the discussion on the 2,000 watt society, but actually later said, well, we need a little bit different building codes because we are North America, and so, which is probably not true, but that's what they have. But they have been pushing specifically based on these ideas of the 2,000 watt society in this building. Munich has decided to go the way of Zurich and would like to reach also in 2050 something similar to what Zurich has been doing. Then the big things, what is now in different stages of planning and building, Paris Saclay. This is, now we talk about 400,000 inhabitants. So this is the new university they are building up. They specifically are based on in their planning on the 2,000 watt society. Minneapolis is discussing at the moment not only to have a small part of a region, but they want to actually implement that for the full city. So this is in discussion. Whether then politically it will be implemented or not, we'll see. But also interestingly, Paris, it doesn't have the Olympics yet, but it says in all these brochures it will actually follow closely the experience of the 200 watt sites to actually plan the Paris for Olympics. So the 2,000 watt society is not nothing. It actually starts to catch up people like that and actually go forward. Yeah, don't worry about 5 minutes. I will be finished in 5 minutes. Now I said, so everybody said, well, okay, 2,000 watt society costs you a lot of money, and actually it will cut the GDP. And so I took the newest numbers from the World Bank about the GDP and the 2018 energy data. And what you see here is how many watt per capita is used, and then the GDP of the countries. So this is kind of the line where you think the more energy you use, the more GDP you do. So Canada is close to it. Even the Arabic Emirates are close to this line, and here you see Russia down here China. But this interesting is actually what these outliers are up here. That doesn't actually mean, and this is not CO2 output, this is energy use. If we would put CO2 out of it, being a Swiss, I would say, I must say Switzerland would even be better, because almost all the electricity is CO2 free, so it's 60% hydro and 40% nuclear, wherever you love it. But the thing is, you see actually all these countries, including Singapore, who are much higher up there. That I don't want to make this conclusion, but the thing is, if you become more efficient with your energy, you become richer. So what's in the way? It's no economic reason not to do it. It's actually every reason to do it. And these numbers are, I know, they have always a tendency, and you get the result you want to by putting in the numbers. But the thing is, it really shows that those who do something are actually innovative. It is not probably a measure of energy and GDP. It's a measure of being an innovative country. And all these countries up here clearly are in all the areas where you look are actually among the most innovative ones. So it does make sense. So coming now at NTU, being at NTU, you know, I had to a little bit also push the NTU to go into this direction. So what we have achieved in the meantime, and you saw that actually in the NTU 90% of the energy is actually operational, that it makes sense to actually do something in the operational sense, and only in the secondary space to look at the buildings itself, but on the operation, it makes sense. So we have put up 5 megawatt rooftop solar, but unfortunately only covers 5% because we are using so much electricity for all the research parts. But we have been reducing our energy per square meter by 35% compared to 2011. This is implemented, and we have built quite a lot. And even with that, we were able to reduce down to 35%. Over 95% of the buildings are green mark platinum. So this is something the construction, our ODFM actually likes because they can show. And they get the awards. They have got an award, 7 zero energy buildings and 1 super energy building in 2019. They got these awards from the building agencies here. The vision is to go to 10 megawatt PV, to reach the 500 watt per person, which is based on the 2000 watt society. Actually, we are on 750. This is for the workspace. We want to go to 2030, net zero emission, zero water and waste on the campus. And we would like to build an iconic, most sustainable building and transportation on the campus future. This is our 2030 goal. This is the new business school, or how it will look like. It will become the biggest wooden building in the tropics. It is in the planning stage. Everything is done. When we have the money, it will start. The place is already reserved for it. Now, it was actually interesting is we have all these nice new buildings here, and I run into this architect at the opening, and this is the architect who actually built the arch. Richard Kirk is from Australia. And then I told him, he asked me why I'm there. I said, well, we have built this Forum Kriesbach, and then he said, oh, okay, never heard about it. And I said, I'll send you the papers. And then I sent him the papers, and then he wrote me back that actually, he said this was iconic for him. That changed the way the design of many architects who were at the front line actually were taking up and said, yes, we have to do something on the embedded energy, also to be more efficient. And he specifically said, and I think this is interesting, I agree strongly, we always should encourage our client to set measurable targets for their buildings like they are done in the 2000 Watt Society. So we have just to tell the architects what they have to do. And then they go back and get the engineers involved and make more efficient buildings. This is kind of the end of the talk, but before we go into the discussion, I would like to make kind of an announcement. So for all who don't know about it, things which will be discussed here in Singapore next week is the S3, or the sustainability, the Singapore Sustainability Symposium. This time we look at the financing. How do you do that? Does sustainability actually create assets for a global competitiveness? And we will have a huge international, a lot of internationally high-standing people are coming from Europe, from the US, from China, and we'll talk about that. And we have chosen them that actually it's all positive. No, sure, but they will give you examples. All those who have been actually designing the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, but one person are all there. We will have big companies from China coming in. Inspur, China Life will be there telling about their experience. So it will be an interesting symposium. So if ever you would like to come, it's at the Grand Hyatt. It's from the 8th to the 10th of May. And if you go to the website, Sustainapur SG, you will get all the information. With that, I would like to end, and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Zehnder, for sharing the vision of a 2000 watt society and what we need to do to actually achieve it. I'd like to invite now Mr. Tan Hann on stage to moderate the discussion and Q&A session. So please, during the Q&A session, please maybe share your name and your organization where you're from. And then if we have colleagues who are at the side who can pass you the mic, right, please raise your hand. Okay, Zehnder, maybe I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor, for the really, really power-packed talk. I think that's a lot of numbers to take for Friday evening, wouldn't you say, guys? But let us, go through a few of the key points, my few key takeaways from this. Before that, could I ask you guys to do a quick stretch? Right? Do a quick stretch. Turn to the person next to you, and go. Let us aim for 2,000 watts. All right, so here are my takeaways as over the past hour. So basically, a 2,000 watt society. I've got a few questions, of course, which we'll start off with. We looked at the metrics for demand, right? What sort of metrics actually would basically, I suppose, measure how we can sort of assess ourselves in terms of a carbon neutral or towards a lower carbon society. We looked at the possibility of energy per capita and basically equilibrating or coming up with a global standard for this too, and the breakdown of energy consumption in our daily lives. Quite some interesting stats, which I'd like to ask you a little bit more about. We looked at discussions on embodied energy and the reduction potential of buildings, right? Seeing that most of us, or some of us, are in that sector as well. Also, as a consumer, what we can do to actually try to hit 2,000 watts per capita. And also comparisons of, I suppose, most first world economies. All right, so the first question, and if you already have that question in your mind, I'm sorry, I'm going to steal it. First question is, why 2,000? What has allowed you to come back to that magic number, 2,000? And I think my bigger question is, why has it not changed from 2,000 watts per person from 2011 to 2019?
Well, it started in the 90s already, and we started out with 1,000 and thought this is a great number. But you can always have this kind of very high goals you want to achieve. But if it actually is so high that everybody says from the very beginning, forget it, it is not very helpful. And 2,000 watt at that time was actually, with a few innovations which were still needed, was basically technical achievable. And it would actually take care of many of the issues we are discussing now with the CO2 emission. And now you can ask me, why didn't we use CO2? The first thing is clear, sure, we all want to make sure that we are not actually emitting more CO2 because of the climate. But that would only take the CO2. It will not take the resources into account. Right. And resources are important. And I know if we say 2,000 watt and everything is from renewable, I think we are on a good track. But 95% of the energy used at the moment are fossil. So in the moment you cut actually energy, you cut also CO2 emission. We know it's not entirely the ideal number which covers everything, but it's something people do understand and can actually do something with it. The CO2 is still very abstract.
Thank you. I agree with that fully, because so much of our manufacturing processes also puts back nitrogen, phosphorus, as well as sulfur back into the environment. And I think if we go by the planetary boundaries model, you'll see that climate change is really just one of our many problems, right? Which includes, biogenetic diversity and what we're actually doing as far as life on the planet is concerned, right? So, very much agree with you on that. So before the lecture, of course, I went through your credentials and your CV just to identify, hey, what could I possibly, ask a professor before looking at the slides, right? And well, first of all, it's super breathless. There's an endless list of credentials. But what struck me more was you're a water expert as well, and you're basically affiliated with the Alberta Water Research Institute, right? And I was just curious to know, in your presentation, you talked about energy primarily. You talked a little bit about waste, right? I'd like to know your thoughts on water, because, hey, I think energy, water, and waste are really what we're dealt with, are the cards that we're dealt with for our generation, and basically, the biggest problems we're going to face.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I have to change my CV on the internet because I actually stopped with Alberta about a year ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But the thing was, it's interesting. What I did basically in Alberta was working with oil and gas, and this is one of the biggest producer, if you want, to fossil fuel is comes from Alberta, and one of the dirtiest, in quote, is from the oil sands. And so they needed kind of the energy and the water is very much interlinked. So because you have to extract it, you have to use water. And I don't come to Singapore and tell Singapore how they have to deal with water. You have all the best specialists of the world, you know. Former CEO of PUB here, so that's the best people in the world who know how to do it. So they have asked me a few questions before, but they have a lot of the things have implemented and done much better. So the energy part actually came along because at the end of the day, the water issues, if you have enough energy, the water issues can be resolved. You can resolve everything if you have enough energy. You can recycle, and so you put a lot of energy into it. The moment, as you are not using fossil fuel, if you are using the sunlight for the energy generation, there is enough to use 3 or 4 times more than we use now, which is actually technologically usable. So we have even more than that, but technologically usable. If we catch all that, all these issues are gone because we have enough energy and it actually doesn't have a negative impact. But the thing is, wherever you go and move and do something, you come across energy. And in the last years also, what I did in Alberta, but also when I came to Singapore and to work at the NTU, energy was everywhere. So that's why in the thoughts at the very beginning is we have to tackle the energy issue to find solutions for the rest. I know it's not as easy as it sounds, but energy is the big integrator at the end of the time. Understanding something from water is helpful. Understanding something on material fluxes is very helpful. Understanding about climate change is very helpful, but at the end, it all boils down to the same thing, and that's energy.
So within the next decade or so, I think out of 3 of us, 2 of us will no longer have access to clean water, right? Would a 2,000 watt per capita society allow for a problem such as this to be solved, given that the assumption is with sufficient energy, we could desalinate, we could, do all sorts of things to water to treat it, and we could provide clean water again?
Yeah, now I almost have to give another talk about that, but I give you a few simple numbers.
Sure.
Humans do drink per year 1 cubic meter of water, between 1 and 3 cubic meter of water. This translates to 3 to 9 liters per day. So that's enough for drinking water. That costs you, at the technology we are using here in Singapore, about 2.4 kilowatt hours. How much do you pay for the kilowatt hour? Nothing. So everybody has enough drinking water if they have access to the technology. Just when you talk about drinking water. If you need for the hygiene, it goes up to about 20 cubic meters. It's little. We need clean water or good quality water for producing our food. We actually eat the water. We are not drinking it. So for the drinking water, it is the implementation of the right technology. And I know there are developing countries where it's difficult, but the technology is there, the understanding is there, it has to be implemented. And it's more of a question of how to do it than whether it is possible. It is possible, and it's easily done once you have the infrastructure in place. The problem is, and I jump now onto another level because that's a very society important level, is the moment when you want to deal with the water issues around the world, you have to deal with infrastructures. Okay. You have to deal with big investments. You have to deal with how you run big investments. Right. And there actually, I read once in The Economist, there is not a water issue, there is a management issue on this world.
Thank you, Professor. That gives us a lot of new insights onto what we read and also, what we think we're facing. I especially like the chart where you basically mapped the GDP of mostly first world countries against the watt per capita and drew the, I suppose, a bit of a conclusion that, hey, it is possible to go low energy but still maintain a high GDP yield, right? What would you say the relationship then of watt per capita on the horizontal axis versus livability on the vertical axis would then be, right? Seeing that, hey, this is a CLC lecture, and B, I think beyond GDP, we're looking at different modes of economics now, different metrics of economics. We're in human satisfaction, we're in, I think, the basic human condition being met is also a measure of economics as much as GDP.
So the developing countries are there, but they are not named. So the other dots are kind of in the lower left corner there. They are the developing countries, not high GDP and not much energy. Yes, did you see the pictures I showed you from these new developments? They all look great. It's a lot of green space. It is not only the building, it's also the green space. And I would say if you do it in a consequential manner, actually the livability increases drastically. People want to go and live there. The interesting thing, that building, the Kreisbach building, everybody said people will not like to work in a building who is kind of high energy efficient and so. I can tell you, everybody was happy to work there. Everybody wanted to go there. There was this kind of special feeling in there. So I have a theory about it, but it's too long. But the thing is, people do like that, and people go in this energy efficient building because people do want to do, flatly said, good, you know, and still have a good life. I don't think that comes in his way. I think the livability actually increases. And if I showed you that we have to invest into the public transport to actually move the people around in the 2000 watt society, this is the point which actually has also to do with livability. Take the cars off the street.
All right, okay, point well noted. Maybe a couple more questions before we open it up to the floor. How am I doing with time? We're good? Okay. To me, it's really surprising and also really eye-opening that in terms of the priorities on the low-hanging fruit for the reduction in wattage per person, we start off with our own living and working versus our consumer food and goods, and only after that does infrastructure come in, right? Do you have any thoughts on why? Because you would imagine that, hey, the base infrastructure and buildings, you know, consuming about 40% of the world's energy and so on, you'd imagine that would come first, as opposed to our complete overhaul on our methods or our lifestyles of living, working, and consuming food.
Yeah, it's because it's dynamic. We get all the time more people on this globe, and if we live all as we have lived 20 or 30 years ago, it will just collapse. It will come to an end. That means the people. This is kind of the dynamic factor in the whole equation, is the amount of people. So if the people are actually making the right choice, then we can come with the infrastructure as a second, and we know all how much time it needs and how expensive it is. But when we all start at the individual level to do certain things which don't really make your life less livable, I must be clear about it. This is not the goal. The goal is to make your life even more livable, but giving you also a good feeling that actually that you do a good life and not hurting too much the others at the moment or those who come after you. So the real dynamic factor is the population growth. And if we can actually we cannot do anything about the population growth because we all had the amount of kids we wanted to have, and so why should I now tell somebody else that they can only have one child or two children? And so I think it comes to an ethical question. But we have to give them the instruments and the tools that their life will not be such a heavy burden on the entire humanity. And we talk about the humanity, the Earth, it doesn't care about us. You know, it has survived many others for a long time. It will recover from us. That's not an issue. We have to look for ourselves. It's for the humanity. And we have to reduce the burden from individuals for the growing amount of individuals. Then we can handle it. I'm totally positive about it. Either we learn it by hitting the head against the wall or taking the curve before we crash in the wall. And we still have time to actually do things before we crash, but we are not so far away from the wall anymore. So we better start to turn around.
Thank you, Professor. I think in recent memory, there's another comic book character in popular culture who thinks overpopulation is the bane of the universe. But that really brings up, I suppose, another hour of discussions and thoughts. But
better solve our problems first.
That is true. All right, one final question from me then. Given that this lecture is in Singapore, and given our propensity for, I would suppose, encouraging what is good by giving incentives and discouraging what is not so good by, proposing taxes and so on, what would you say would be a model of, trying to achieve 2,000 watts per capita? Would it be taxation if one household is found to not or to grossly exceed that value, or if I basically live really, really sort of humbly energy-wise and only hit 850 watts per capita per year, right? Would I get some sort of incentive? How do you see this being implemented out as a real-world model?
I have a problem with punishments, and people do actually. I don't like to be punished, and I don't think anybody likes that. And punishment are not very good because they always create other problems beside it. Incentives. Yeah, I can think about a few incentives which are actually the most immediately to see that if you say the taxation depends, besides the amount of money, also the amount of energy use. So those who are humble pay less taxes. That's an incentive. It's actually good for you if you do the right stuff. That's one possibility. There are other possibilities. And we see that also around the world, that actually if you look to Europe, that all those who started to implement photovoltaic, they actually got kind of a tax cut from the government, specifically in Germany. Payback, you can actually sell the electricity to the same price as you buy it. All these kind of things are very good incentives. So we always have to think about what can we do that actually people want to do it, and not that we have to force the people. It's easier said than done. I totally agree with that. But the thing is, we need our brains. And our economists, and I'm sorry I'm not stepping on the foot of too many of economists here in the room, our economists should not always look at the kind of the efficiency of things, At the end of the day, they should think about the incentives. What kind of incentives we can actually implement to turn things around. I'm not kind of seeing all these incentives. I think we have to ask the people. And this is another thing, why I think architects, and I'm sorry that you are an architect, architects alone should not design a building.
I agree with you.
Because the architect alone has not all the ideas in the world. The more money and more people who are involved, directly involved, the better it becomes, because you actually fuse all these things together.
Yeah, I think, well, speaking on behalf of the profession, we do have to curate, right? But at the same time, also basically understand that, hey, inherently, architects cannot understand everything in the world. Our minds are not wired like engineers' minds, for instance, and we do need to take that into account, plus economics. And speaking of which, there's a lot of recent, I suppose, discussions where I think the growth of countries the growth of nations should no longer be measured by GDP alone. Right, as part of the overall circular economy discussion, and more recently the donut economy discussion. And I'm interested to see how that can also come in terms of our energy consumption discussions. Right? Finally, before we open to the floor, between 2011 and 2019, in Singapore, we've seen probably about 5 or 6 different versions, or evolved versions now for green building ratings in our green mark. We've seen many other metrics come about in terms of sustainable, I suppose, consumption, and more recently also introduction to zero waste, right? What would your observations be, I think, in Singapore between 2011 and today?
I think there is a big change. I think there is the mindset starts to change. 2011, I still remember that time in Singapore where actually water was still number one. And it is because of we are Singapore, it's always number one. At that time, the discussion started, what should actually follow our strategy? And there was a big discussion. And immediately I said, that was already, I think, 2010, I said, why don't you do energy? I don't know, energy is still kind of controlled by the energy market, and that will take care of itself. I think in the meantime, we all learned it's not so. And if you go now to agencies within the government, you talk to ministers, you talk to people working in the different agencies, you see that there is now very clearly this idea and this vision. We want to have a smaller footprint as Singapore, but we want to develop. That means we have to take sustainability, we have to take efficiency, we have to take innovation actually into the development of Singapore for the future. There is a change in mindset, I think. It is clear. It's also what's happening outside. Everything had an influence. But to talk about this thing now is much easier than it was 10 years ago. I think there is a fundamental change in the movement. And everything had an influence there, and I think it goes in the right direction.
Thank you, Professor. That certainly calls for some good celebration. Now, can I open up to the floor if there's any questions from the audience? I think we can take 2 questions at one time. Yes, the lady in front.
I'm Juren from SFA, and I just want to ask, because with 2,000 watt society, it obviously makes sense to be in a more population dense society. So how would you handle the optics of trying to say, okay, you've just got to live in a denser environment, and how it can actually achieve it in a way that can be quantified?
Thank you for the question, actually. It's easy because people flock into cities. People like to densify, and you have more than 50% of the people now living in cities. In 30 years, it's over 75%. So they will go automatically into cities. And the cities are the places where actually the economic growth is triggered. So the economic growth is happening in the cities. This combination will force the people go into this direction. Yes, I would say per person, the footprint in the rural area is bigger. But because the population is much less dense, the total impact is smaller. But I would say the development actually will go in the direction to live denser. And if we have to look at on transport, the mobility, density is an enormous factor actually, which helps to make things more efficient. Sprawling cities like you have in North America, you can do that because you have all the space you want to. If you go to Canada, you know, wherever you go outside of the city, it's all empty. So people do sprawl, but at the end of the day, it becomes an issue of how to run these sprawling cities, and the infrastructure becomes extremely more expensive. And if people have to pay it, they will go back to the more condensed thing. It's now it's already, I would say, the pendulum is swinging back to more dense environment, specifically also because it's more fun. You have colleagues around, you have restaurants, you have theaters, and so when the density is higher, life is better, life is more fun than if you are kind of living outside by yourself in the green field. I think we don't really have to do anything. It will automatically go in this direction. But it's helpful if we make the living in a higher density more fun and better. That helps.
Wow, some really, really good points of contention there too. I think the discussion on density, of course, on how life's comforts can actually be found in a dense environment. That's a really interesting concept, and how we, as I suppose, shapers of our environment, can actually contribute to that. That's something to, I suppose, discuss a little bit further. But for now, do we have any other questions from the floor? Yes.
Yes. Is it really too late?
Sorry, your name and your
I
representation.
am Daniel Szue. Yes, freelance environmental surveyor and photographer. Is it really too late to return us to the 2,000 watt society, or not to reverse the damage we've done through our unsustainable energy release?
I hope I didn't say it's too late, because I'm a positive thinker myself. We did some damage, clear. You go around here in the neighborhood of Singapore, and you see what this damage is of having all these high populations in the big cities. I wouldn't say it's too late. It's only the time. We always have to see the time frame. It will pendule itself back into a certain equilibrium, but we can actually prevent that going faster or slower. So if we start to cut down on the release of CO2, these climate active gases, and specifically CO2, because that stays forever in the atmosphere, if we start to cut that back, we will not see an effect in the next 5 to 10 years. It will take to 2100 until at least we would see an effect. And if we are not stopping now, it just takes a little bit longer. So it will take time. The question is how much collateral damage we are doing on the way from here to there. And the faster we do something, the better it is. But I'm conscious about it. We have built a city like Singapore here. The buildings are actually here. We cannot just throw them flat and build all new buildings. It is impossible. We have to start to manage how we do this renewal step by step, where we can do retrofitting, where it may be making sense actually to build something new. I would say it's never too late. It's always time to do it. The question is, what is the collateral damage if we are not doing it now, but actually postpone it to the next generation? So I think it's okay. But I think either we are forced to do it somewhere down the road, or we can, having the will now ourselves to actually do it and going a step in this direction. That's all it is. So I hope I didn't put this negative sign out, we are going under and the big catastrophe, and so I actually don't like that, because it is not so. We still have quite a lot of flexibility, but the longer we push it out, the more difficult it becomes.
All right, we've got 2 questions from the floor, one from the gentleman in front and also the gentleman in the third row. Can we probably address both questions?
I'm Winston Wave, architect from A+ Solar Consortium. I'd like to ask the professor, when was the 2,000 watt society set up? And it's very interesting because I was involved in solar energy since the 70s. And when I was invited to National Research Foundation set up in 2006 in Istana, I asked many top government people, asked them, why you never do any solar energy research? They say, oh, Singapore is not enough solar, sun, and all that. But it really took off when the Norwegian company knocked at EDB and wanted to set up a plant here. And EDB was surprised that solar panels can make money. And that is where the whole government changed the whole national research. I don't know how long you were in Singapore, in the 2011 or 10, but I think that is where the whole direction changed. I look at Singapore, in fact, our solar energy implementation in public housing is not really the solution. Because 2,000 watts actually you go into people's mind to save energy. I like to know how in Zurich, you get everybody involved, 70%. Is it because of 2,000 watt society do all the talking, lobbying? Because you need education. And also the thing is that in our HDB design and building, I was an architect there before. We don't let the owner have any choice, right? If we let the owner say, I can put something up for capturing solar energy and all that to save energy, they will be incentivized. And in their lifestyle, they will also go into 2,000 watt, that sort of thinking. How can I save more? So I'd like to have your view, because you're in Singapore for some time, and I really appreciate like what you talk about, because energy at the end is the thing in design, in the thinking, and in our survival.
Thank you. We'll take the second question too.
Right. My name is Sanjeev Panda. I come from the National University of Singapore. Thank you very much for exciting talk and the details that you provided. My question is, if my calculations are right, somewhere on your slide I saw that to maintain our standard of living in Singapore per person, per capita, we use about approximately 7,500 watt. I saw also at NTU, you want this to be dropped to about 750 watt. So from 7,500 to 750 is a 10:1 scale. When do you think we'll be able to achieve that target of 750 watt per person? That's the first question. Second question is, we talk about energy and everything, being environmentally friendly, use less fossil fuel, but no matter how much we talk about it, unless and until it pinches each individual, the cost of using energy, people will not change their mindset. It will take a generation for people to change mindset that I must turn off the light when I leave the room. I have been an educator at NUS for the past 20 years or 26 years. I keep teaching people about electrical machines, energy efficiency, and I say that you should switch off the light. Till date, as I walk my corridor, rooms are empty, lights are on. So unless and until the energy cost pinches you, the water cost pinches you, people will not change their mindset. We can develop technology, sensors, turn it off, but unless it is in their mind that yes, it is expensive and I must save, that would take a lot of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will his first question first before I come, because the second one is about about the same thing. Just the numbers. Singapore uses approximately 6,000 and a few little watts per person. So it is a 6,000 watt society. And so it's not 7,500, it's 6,000. When you see higher numbers, this is because of the bunkering of the gasoline and the oil here. So that has been taken out. So it is the real use. So, and the 750 is what it is on NTU at the moment. We want to go from 750. This is only per square meter for living or for working, because most of NTU is for working. We want to go from 750 to 500. That means we go only by 1/3 we go down. So that's feasible by replacing the buildings and so. The numbers are, the rest is actually infrastructure, is the transport, is cooling down the building, you name it, and going to the shopping mall and all these kind of things. It's all in there, but that's between the 750 and the 6,000. So we want to bring the whole thing down step by step. But for the living quarter and the working quarter, we want to go from 750 to 500. If we are able to do, but we have the old buildings, and the old buildings still are actually coming in our way. So that's the first thing. So this is just for the number. And now the second question you had actually is very similar to what the gentleman here had, is how did you actually start with it and how could you convince the people? Yes, the easiest thing to convince, so let me start. It started somewhere in the 90s, after Rio, when the sustainability discussion started. We had a few people around the table from different institutions in Switzerland, from the two ETHs in Zurich and in Lausanne, and the Research Institute. And we were actually thinking about how can we actually implement some of the ideas which have been brought forward. And there came all kinds of ideas out of it. And now, don't laugh when I tell you that, but the thing is, at the table we started to think about not how can we convince politicians or people. The idea was always, how can we convince an analytical chemist to be more sustainable? Because analytical chemists, by definition, they measure whatever, but they are not in the first instance going about sustainability, at least at that time. In the meantime, it's over. But the thing is, we started to try to figure out what can we do that it's understandable for everybody. And that's how we came on that. And as I said, we started with 1,000 and then thought, no, this goal is too ambitious. In a sense, it doesn't help to be over-ambitious. It helps to be ambitious, but not over-ambitious. And that's why we ended up at the 2,000. We did it not just by discussing it, but some people at the Energy Research Institute, the Paul Scherrer Institute, they did the basic calculations if this is feasible and so on. And that's how we came out of this 2,000, whether it's 1,800 or 2,000, it doesn't matter. It has to be a simple number. And how can you convince? How can you convince the people to do it? So I must say we have a political situation in Zurich which is helpful because the city is run by Social Democrats and the Greens. So there is already a certain openness to go in this direction. The problem is that both the kind of the leftist governments try to do more regulation, and you don't want to have regulations. And they started actually to like this idea of this 2,000 watt society. It is a planning tool. It's not the regulation. You don't find it in the law, it has to be. But it is the planning tool for the city to go in this direction. And what you have to, you will come back to the incentives. You know, this is, the building then showed it's possible. And actually people like to be in that building. Why shouldn't we do it? And that's exactly where we have to go. We should not punish people. We should create incentives. We have a lot of things who all of a sudden popped up technologically, gadgets which people like to have. Why not have energy efficiency in a certain way in a gadget, which actually makes them, hey, it's cool to do it. You know, it's not something we are forced to do. It's actually cool to do it. And I don't have the ideas of how you do it in the specific cases. I think in some cases with the light, you put a sensor there. If nobody is there, the light turns off, so that's easily done. But for other things, it's more complicated. Big cars, people like big cars. Okay, so we have to figure out how we can actually find an alternative to be a macho in a big car. I haven't found the basic solution yet, otherwise I would be a rich man in the meantime. But there are certain things where we have actually to think about things which have a positive impact and not forbidding and you're not allowed, because we all know people are very clever to go around regulations. So why not use their cleverness to actually go along the line we want to go? And that's the idea. I don't have an answer on all your questions you had. I don't know it. But I think we have even our phones here, you know. Wouldn't you have thought 25 years ago that everybody walks around with a computer in their pocket? No. But it became cool, became handy. It was helpful. It's all about innovation. We do innovation, and if we can actually package that innovation in coolness, you don't even have to do anything. It goes all by itself. The young people will pick it up and they will go. I think there is where we have to think about, and not to think about what should we forbid as the next one, and where we have to tax something, and where it has to cost. We have to think about how we make the life of everybody cooler by actually achieving this goal.
In fact, it's a culture that you have to cultivate, and it becomes a lifestyle where, you know, I mean, you have done it in Switzerland. You should promote this in Singapore.
I tried for 10 years.
Because in the 80s, I designed a solar kindergarten, West Coast, Japanese kindergarten. And they like it because the children like it, and children have very little flu because the air was ventilated by solar induction. So you see, these sort of things, it has to be, because I done the research in university, my thesis was in solar energy design. But it hasn't gone through everybody, you see. But your 2,000 watt society is interesting because your whole Zurich, the city, 70% go to this. I think Singapore, we should cultivate this, that everybody in their thinking, even the HDB design, it has to be such that people have a choice to put in something where it can receive the sun, somehow they can reduce their energy, because in their lifestyle, they're able to have a choice. They see, oh, my next door also do something like this, dry my clothes faster, I can create my own solar water, rather than everything on the rooftop, right? Individual house, they able to have a choice, that it makes things nicer. Now you see HDB design, there are more colors now, because the architects now more creative. They should be able to, even every unit, they have a choice that they can design within, put in the things. So from institution to architects, to engineers, it becomes a whole society, whole country itself will be, you know, energy saving, to green and all this.
Yeah, it didn't take, very short, it didn't take us 3 days to implement that. We needed also almost 20 years that we get there. You know, the first idea started somewhere in 93 probably, and so the first discussions, and before it came to the plebiscite, it was 2008. So it takes time. It's clear, it takes time. Everybody has, at least a critical mass has to get there. And once you have a critical mass, it's almost like a self-professing thing, just moving ahead, because people talk about it, people are convinced. And you need a few showcases. You have to show it. If you are not showing it, not theoretically, practically, you have to put a few buildings down where people like to see it and say, hey, it's feasible. That is a catalyst.
All right, with that, thank you so much, Professor Dr. Alexander Zehnder. It was, you know, super enlightening for me as well, and I think you've given all of us a really good dose of reality, urgency, and optimism, all within 2 hours. So with that, can I invite us all to thank Dr. Zehnder? Thank you. Thank you.